So Dave, maturity meters. So I guess if I'm trying to understand what that does is it allows you to maybe use a little bit less cement, but if the temperature doesn't go according to plan, then you can wait an extra day till the strength gets up there. Is that?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I would probably state it the other way. I would state that it validates, do I have the right mix for the right situation, including application, ambient temperature, things like that. As you get into the cooler months, it's very common to switch over to a different mix, winter mix, or maybe a different mix altogether. And so those things have carbon implications. And so if you're finding that you're meeting your strengths and meeting your schedule, that could forestall switching over to that mix, and that could shave off just a little bit of emissions that you did not need to emit. And the other thing is that, oh, sorry. The other thing is that as we, this is not totally new, but fairly new. And so as we start to build case studies of mixes, temperature, applications, it helps us get better for future projects to have that conversation that yes, we feel confident that this will work, because nervousness is kind of the enemy of carbon reduction, and understandably so. So this is another data point to help address that.
Okay, great. We have a question for Dave, I'm assuming. Have you implemented electronic ticketing on projects already? Do you need to start the conversation, I guess, for architects, you need a conversation with the GC and supplier to make sure the data stream is set up in an effective way?
So yes, we have set up electronic ticketing, and the data flow is flowing. And we are, at the front end of kind of taking the data flow and doing analytics. I know that, we do quite a bit with Power BI. And the idea is that, we would start to use Power BI to be able to get a dashboard and see where we're at. I would sort of say that this still lands in the domain of means and methods. So it is a great, I think, tool in the contractor's toolbox to go even further beyond material optimization. I wouldn't go nuts with putting it in your specs right now, but I think it's a good conversation to have with your teammates.
Mm-hmm. So Kelsey, question for you about, so you come up with specs, you publish your 100% CD set, and now somebody from MK is on CA. How involved are they in the concrete mix design and questions about that? Is that something that you're typically involved in, or is that something that it's entirely in the contractor's hands once you issue your 100% spec?
We like to be involved, especially if it's needed. So for example, on the EPD topic, when we put those in our specs, depending on the market, Seattle, the Northwest is really sophisticated on this topic, but in other markets where there's a little less sophistication, if we put EPDs in our specs, we'll probably hear about it. And so it's one of those things where you can't just put it in a spec and walk away, right? It's best for you to be there, to be supporting, and really to become an agent of education, because that's what a lot of this is about, especially for markets that are less sophisticated. It's helping them understand why it's important, and then helping them understand how to meet the specification as well, instead of kind of leaving them hanging once the specs are issued. So I think that's really important. And in the Northwest, we're really, really lucky. We have so many great relationships with the contractors. And it's just about finding those relationships elsewhere as well.
Yeah, to kind of follow on that, Kelsey, Dave, or Dennis, how much education do you have to do of the concrete suppliers around here in order to get them to do what you want? Is that a light lift at this point, or is it?
I would say, your concrete suppliers in this region are some of the most sophisticated people in the conversation, honestly. They are the material scientists. And so, they get the intent, and several of them have done, R&D research to come up with more carbon efficient mixes. So we're lucky, frankly, in this region that we have sophisticated, knowledgeable people. They're some of the strongest people in the team. So everybody has a role, to set up the design, to optimize, to set up, the constructability bit, but, the actual solution is coming from your suppliers.
Yeah, and how early so I'm an architect, how early should architects and our structural engineering friends talk to suppliers in the design process? Or is that something that is just, we should wait until we're done with the design to talk to suppliers?
For us, the earlier the better. And it's not just the suppliers, right? It's also the contractor too, because, they are the gatekeeper for a lot of this. And so making sure that you're on the same page and you're kind of presenting a united front with the contractor, and then reaching out to suppliers. Because, for example, for this performance-based or for putting any kind of GWP in the bids, in the supplier bids, you need to telegraph those intentions early, because otherwise they're going to see it all of a sudden. They didn't have any time to prepare. Maybe they don't have EPDs yet. And then now it's a scramble for them, or maybe it's not even possible in the timeline that they need. So I think it's the earlier that you're thinking about these things and the earlier you have those relationships, the better.
Yeah, I just want to add, especially if anybody on the calls in the owner's seat is, if you're a public agency, if you're that, it's like, have that conversation now. The opportunity that we had was bringing our structural team to, with the sustainability team, with the suppliers, and that opened the door, so you can start having conversations that seems to be difficult to move forward because you started to build those relationships. And like David said, is that the suppliers are your best friends in this region.
Great. Baha, so Baha joined us, and ZGF has a concrete tool. We want to spend a couple minutes on it and then put a link or contact information or something?
Sure, sounds good. So maybe I'll just share my screen and show the tool. Okay, perfect. So yes, some of you might already be familiar with the tool, so I'll just quickly go over it. Chell, is it okay to take maybe 5 minutes?
I think if you pique people's interest, they'll contact you. So
sure. So I guess in summary, lca-tool@zgf.com. You guys could get a copy of it. The tool is pretty simple. It gives you the instructions of, basically the capabilities that it could do an LCA of any concrete mix design using data from Tally and NRMCA. But something it does is that you just type your mix design and you select a string, it'll find an NRMCA baseline for you. You could choose 2019 or 2016, or you could also go out of an RMCA and do your own baseline if you want to. But something important is that it'll run the NRMCA study. It uses the ingredients, but it'll run it through the same data set that it's using for the ingredients. And you would see a difference here. Typically, if you type the same, or if you look at the NRMCA benchmarks and see the same mix design, it might show a different global warming potential for that concrete. That might be 10, 15, 20% difference. So we use this to have the baseline be equivalent to the proposed in terms of the LCA data. So you just type the numbers, it'll run the LCA, and it'll tell you how much better or worse that mix design is. And you could add many mix designs and get an average for all of your mix designs in terms of how much better or worse they are.
Awesome. Yeah, and this is freely available?
Yeah, this is just freely available to anyone interested. At ZGF, we started on one project, and then just knowing how that project was elite platinum, pursuing many things, and then we recently were just pursuing on all of our projects. We're trying to optimize concrete by using this, even if they're not doing a whole building LCA.
Cool. Do you want to put the link or the email in the chat?
Yeah, sure.
Use it. Yeah, and then you said you sent out user updates as well, right?
Yeah. So it's at version 3.1 right now. Every once in a while, depending on the comments we get, we do a little bit of updates to it.
Great. Dennis had a question for everybody that I would love any comments on through the chat, or you can unmute yourself, which is, what is the best way to for an owner to incentivize the design build team to reduce embodied carbon in general, but probably today specifically on concrete? And panelists are welcome to answer it, or anybody else can unmute themselves and have a conversation. Is that the question, Dennis, that you wanted to ask?
I mean, you can build on, because I think Dave touched on it, and Kelsey mentioned it. Is like, it's setting minimums, it's setting opportunities. So it's performance-based language, but what's the best way to incentivize that? I know the classic thing is just pour a lot of points on it. So they're incentivized either if it's a point structure that awards the bid, or if there's money. But if there's any more nuanced things that anybody has experienced with about what's in a successful incentive in this area, I appreciate hearing it. And yeah, and the other one, Dave, I don't know if you want to elaborate a little bit more about conversations that we've been having on this. Is just to, I know you summarized it in your presentation, but
yeah,
topic,
I think it's important to realize that not only is every project different from an engineering standpoint, projects are different on how they're delivered, and how they're delivered determines the timing of kind of the on-ramp of when your supplier comes on. And so in one project you may be able to have this sort of collaborative back and forth before you even get to nailing down the bid for the set of mixes. But Sound Transit is these are huge projects, impactful projects, but they're choosing the general contractor very early, long before the supplier comes on board. Correct, Dennis?
Yeah. Essentially, we've increasingly kind of switched over to design build contracts. So. And again, just to recap, one of the things that I said is, what we learned from the suppliers is, when you want to have higher low carbon concrete performance, the suppliers need to be part of that conversation early, so they can really speak directly with the design build teams that are in competition for design award about, oh, Sound Transit wants, this is important to them. They will. If we require it, they will start that conversation with the suppliers earlier. And if our bid forms, they can be transparent about what they're willing to perform to, that will get attention at the right time, as David said. And so we're not going to get very far unless we set some expectations right from the start.
So Kelsey, how new are the performance-based specs that you have in other projects? Is this all projects basically now have this performance-based spec? And how far along are the furthest projects that have used this method?
Not all of them. Our general note template is still on the traditional. And actually, we just did this with a project with Sellen and Dave, where we had issued 100% DD. We had a great conversation with Sellen, and then we reissued the sheet for the concrete mix specification table to show that performance base. So it's not every project yet, and part of that reason is because of the market considerations. Like we've been saying, the Northwest, we could probably start doing that on all of our projects, but in some markets, it would take education, and so we're just not there yet. And then as far as the furthest along, I think the furthest along has wrapped up procurement, but hasn't actually been constructed yet.
Okay, great. I mean, that seems like a great way to do it. We had one question: carbon cure and things like that have not been brought up today. What's your opinion on the order of operations for that, and cost effective, best thing to do, 15th thing to do? David, you might have actually mentioned it, but.
Yeah, I didn't mention carbon cure specifically today. I think, that may be a little bit of a depend on regional context. We have very high quality aggregate in this market, and because we have that great aggregate, high compressive strength, we don't need to compensate with a lot of extra cement to stick it together that you might need in, say, LA or some other markets. And so we can tweak our mixes and get, substantial reductions without using carbon cure. Now that may be different in other regions, but for us, I think that, the carbon cure delta is fairly small. I can't put an exact, percentage on it, but it's fairly modest, and it could be actually more significant in other regions for a variety of reasons. So I would really focus, if we're talking Seattle and working with, an experienced supplier, type 1L for sure, work on SEMs, be smart about, picking your mix, things like that, really dial in on waste, because, waste or picking the wrong mix could actually blow your advantage from carbon cure just alone. So, management of mix selection and management, on the construction side also plays a role in that.
Okay.
Kelsey, do you have anything to add?
Projects maybe out of the region?
Yeah, I think that for the most part, what we've been seeing is if an owner comes to us and says, hey, we've heard about this carbon cure, or, whatever it is, what do you think? We always welcome it, but it's not something that we would ever really put in our specifications. And that goes a lot to what Dave was saying, where there's just so much reduction that we can do in the way that mix is specified, or the way that we can work with our suppliers, that something like carbon cure impact is just generally smaller. But if someone wants to do it on the project, they're more than welcome. What we don't want is to put it in a specification and all of a sudden that drives the cost up because maybe a supplier doesn't already have the equipment to do it. And then it becomes a sticking point during procurement, and that's what we're avoiding.
This is Laura with GLY. I've talked to a couple of the concrete suppliers in the area, and so far none of them are set up for carbon cure, and to do so is quite expensive. So before we put anything in a spec, would definitely need to make sure that one of the local suppliers is willing to take on the process, because it's not like just an additive, it's like a full process to create the carbon.
Okay, Jeff.
Yeah, and that's a really good point, Laura, and that's what I was kind of saying, where we don't want to add cost to the project when a supplier is not ready for it. I totally agree.
Jeff asked about graphene. I don't know what that is, but.
Oh, I'm not asking, that's just a teaser, because graphene has some really potentially transformational impacts on a variety of materials, including concrete via cement. But we haven't figured out a cost-effective way to make it until perhaps recently. There's one that's being developed now. The question I did have, though, was about who gets to decide on that limit of the amount of raw limestone that can be added to cement and concrete mixes. Is that a state or a city or a county rule? How does that work?
So, I mean, I can take that. So there are various ASTM standards for that. And so, there's ASTM C150, which just allows kind of the traditional 1, 2, 4 and 5, 1, 2, 3, 4 and 5. Then there's the ASTM 595, which does expand, type 1L. So that's why it's important to have general notes updated to make sure it's referencing the right ASTM, so that, suppliers can do that. And then there's one other ASTM 1157, which is very much open-ended on that. But the short answer is ASTM provides the guardrails, and then jurisdictions and organizations decide whether they are comfortable with the various types of cement.
To add to what Dave said, the other thing that I found is that I'm hearing that the reduced carbon concrete mixes are challenging on flat work because it fires pretty fast, so it makes it really difficult to finish. So that's been a lesson learned.
Is that specific to?
Like PT decks?
Oh, yeah, but is it specific to, slag or fly ash?
That's a good question. I think it's the fly ash.
Okay.
But I'd have to double check that.
And this is a perfect segue on why you should chat with your GC and get that deep knowledge with the people who are the finishers. And that's why you should also chat with your supplier to say, hey, we can go further, but do you realize that, it's really going to be hard to finish. So what's your floor covering on this? Or, hey, we could go deeper, but is this a polished concrete surface? We don't want to have rock pops, things like that. So that's that design GC supplier connection that really needs to happen back and forth before you get that final list of approved mixes.
All right. Well, we can stay in chat for a long time. Thanks everybody for attending. Thanks to the presenters. And this room will be open for a while if people want to chat, but I want to wrap it up for all the people that have other meetings to get to.
Hey, Kel, I do want to make one brief announcement in case you haven't all seen it. On the September 8th and 9th, some of your colleagues, including Dave and Stacy and Baha, are going to be presenting as part of the Building Decarbonization track at the Seattle Go Green Conference, which is now an online event. And if you want to register, you can get a 30% discount using the CLF-30 code. And I encourage you to come, not so much, but you guys are on the leading edge. I mean, you're the ones who are developing the new knowledge about how we're going to achieve this goal. But we want to widen the circle and get everybody participating with sustainability professionals who maybe don't yet understand some of the challenges associated with buildings and bring them into the conversation as well. So, you're going to be encouraged to participate and help problem solve in these sessions. It's not just a presentation.
Awesome.
2/3 of the time is spent talking to each other. So thank you. I hope you can all join us.
Thanks. Yeah, that should be great. All right. Any other questions? Hang out for a bit.
This is Jess Harris. So I did put some information in the chat about green building incentives for City of Seattle. So if people didn't see that, please reach out to me, and I will talk to Jell and some others and see if I can perhaps do some other coordination with your group. So thanks.
Yeah, that sounds good. I know there was a consideration of putting embodied carbon in the energy code. This cycle, I know that didn't end up happening, but that was kind of an interesting conversation, is where embodied carbon goes. Does it go in an energy code? Does it go in some other type of legislation or something else? And that's, how do you get it to happen in a requirement? At first there's like leading edge, which is the people here that are doing it. And then how do you bring everybody along so it's just a normal thing on every project?
Hey, Jess.
Yes.
Oh,
yes.
Are you getting any feedback on the Marin County Green Concrete Code and how that's working?
I know about it. We haven't met with them at all. There's a person from OSE that Ani, I don't know if anybody knows him, but he's been kind of my liaison on this topic because I'm not an expert on this stuff. So I think he has coordinated with some folks there. I know that we thought about actually having a real standard in the incentive, and we kind of walked away from that. So we're just kind of doing like this soft approach, which just, look at EPDs, try to pick the best mix and submit that versus actually requiring it. But it's still open, and I think there's a lot to be talked about.
Jess, do you have an approximate timeline on when that's going to be implemented for the
Yes.
for the green expedited?
Yes, we are going to be aligned with when the technical codes become effective in February 1, 2021. So
Excellent.
and it's really different because, you know, we have a lot of small residential builders that use our incentives. So it's just a different process for them versus a lot of stuff that you've been talking about with high rises, which, you know, we still want those projects to use our incentives, but historically they haven't used it too much. It's mostly the townhouse kind of builders that are using it. So it's going to be a lot of foundations, you know, trying to work with those concrete mixes. So
It's interesting. Are they the same suppliers generally that supply the larger buildings and supply the single family and townhomes? And so do they have a level of sophistication, or is it a totally different market where they wouldn't be as sophisticated potentially?
yeah, I don't know if you're asking me. I mean, that's kind of why I came here, and hopefully try to get those answers and talk to the suppliers and talk to the experts.
Well, I have to admit that that's kind of not typically my world. I mean, I do know that there's some smaller local suppliers, Salmon Bay and others that, you know, may be supplying that. But I think, you know, Jess brings up a really good point that, you know, when it comes to incentives or even legislation, if it goes that way, that it's not a one size fits all, that, you know, there's so much complexity in terms of whether you're building a townhome or something bigger. And then from project to project, you know, if you're setting the cap, how do you set a cap if, you know, your structural type changes radically between the two? You know, do you have a cap for PT structures and then cap for, you know, metal frame with slab on metal deck? You know, it gets super complicated with all the different varieties. And I'm just kind of struggling on an elegant way to do that. And I'm worried that legislation may not have the ability to address all of those tweaks. So.
Nope, definitely. As soon as it gets too complicated, then people usually walk away from incentives and they don't use them.
Yeah.
So then you're not really getting any benefit. So that's the fine line that we're trying to walk. So that's kind of why we landed on just the fact, okay, just provide the EPDs for these materials and that's it, you know? So we'll see if that is something that could work. So if anyone is interested in talking about it more, then please let me know. And some of you, I'm going to just contact you, like Dave, for sure. And Joe and Stacy, I've been talking to a little bit. But if there's anybody out there who wants to reach out to me, please do.
Dave, I know you worked on the Helen Summers building. This is kind of an early breakthrough one, and you know, I'm reminded of, you know, what a huge impact it had when all the state buildings had to perform at least to LEED, and the cost to do LEED went from you know, a lot to very affordable in 3 years because it got the ball rolling. And I don't know if the same is true, and if the building types of state-funded projects are less, or somehow that building type, it would be easier to set some legislation in place that puts expectations there that could get the ball rolling a lot faster.
Yeah, I think that we're kind of at step one of disclosure, and then, you know, storming, norming, performing, right? So, you know, we're gathering the data, then we got to norm it, like, you know, what is a good performing building in an embodied carbon sense? And then the performing is, you know, maybe setting targets on that. Not unlike, you know, energy code, but embodied carbon is, you know, a decade or more behind energy modeling and energy targets and energy code and things like that. But with Helen Summers, there really were not very many EPDs. We require that as part of, you know, if you're going to bid the project, you will provide an EPD. And in quick order, all the major suppliers followed suit. So this can tip super fast, and, you know, with other tools like EC3, it's a different world. So, you know, now we have the ability to gather or to require the data. Now we need to gather it and analyze it and understand, you know, what are the trends to set good legislation or good incentives or things like that.
There are efforts to do just that, you know, like the SC 2050 commitment and challenge is one of those, specifically to help assess where the market's at right now, and then eventually to help make those benchmarks. And that's kind of speaking to the different building types that you were talking about earlier, Dave, of a PT high-rise versus a residential.
There's talk of changing the AIA's DDX, so digital design exchange inputs, to have a field for embodied carbon. And so, you know, in some ways, we need a census of embodied carbon for all these buildings, just like, you know, CBEX is like a census for energy. And, you know, I'm hoping that, you know, the signatories, the architect signatories to 2030, AIA 2030, will start populating that, and hopefully AIA will kind of share regional adjusted and building type adjusted and structural type adjusted data, so we can start to get a feel on that.
Yeah, we SC 2050, we're actually working with the folks that started and are doing the DDX, so that hopefully we're kind of marrying the two well.
Yeah, that's great.
I'll see you all. Thank you. It's fun.
Thanks, Dennis.
Thanks, Dennis.
All right.
All right.
Thanks, everybody.
Right. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you.
Great.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.